The morning of September 15, 2019, began like any other at the Riverside Community Memorial Service. Folding chairs arranged in perfect rows on the freshly cut grass, a small crowd of elderly veterans and their families gathering to honor those who had served. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of traffic from the highway. But hidden among the attendees was a woman whose single bullet had changed the course of history, and nobody had any idea she was there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen pulled her worn Honda Civic into the community center parking lot at exactly 9:30 in the morning. At 28, she possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that made her blend seamlessly into any crowd. Average height, black hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a simple gray cardigan over dark jeans and comfortable walking shoes that had seen better days. She moved with quiet efficiency as she gathered a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums from her passenger seat, the kind of flowers you could buy at any grocery store checkout line. She was here for one reason that morning: to attend the memorial service for Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, her older brother who had died in a training accident 3 years earlier. The annual community memorial had become her private ritual, a quiet way to honor his memory without drawing attention to herself or the complicated history that connected them both to military service. Sarah worked as a librarian at the downtown branch, a job that suited her preference for quiet spaces and minimal human interaction. Her colleagues knew her as someone reliable but reserved, the type of person who ate lunch alone while reading paperback novels and never joined the after-work social gatherings. She lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment, drove the same car she'd owned since college, and maintained a lifestyle so deliberately ordinary that even her closest acquaintances would struggle to describe anything particularly memorable about her. The memorial service was already underway when Sarah found a seat in the back row, positioning herself behind a family with small children so she could remain largely unnoticed. The speaker at the podium was Colonel James Harrison, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He was reading names from a prepared list, each one representing a local service member who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Sarah listened patiently as the colonel worked through the alphabetical roster, waiting for her brother's name while observing the other attendees. Most were elderly veterans from Vietnam or earlier conflicts, their service ribbons and patches telling stories of wars fought decades ago. There were younger family members too, spouses and children of more recent casualties, their grief still fresh and visible in their careful composure. When Colonel Harrison reached the C section of his list, Sarah straightened slightly in her seat. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, United States Army, killed in a training exercise at Fort Bragg. The words hit her like they did every year, a familiar pain that never quite healed. But what happened next was entirely unexpected. "Michael Chen," came a voice from the front row, cutting through the colonel's reading. A man in his 40s had stood up, his voice carrying across the small gathering. "I remember that name from somewhere." The speaker was Richard Lawson, a local businessman who served on the memorial committee and took pride in his connection to military affairs despite never having served himself. Colonel Harrison paused, looking slightly annoyed at the interruption. "Mr. Lawson, if we could continue with the reading." But Lawson wasn't finished. "No, wait, Chun. There was something about a Chun in the intelligence briefings. Some kind of classified operation that went sideways." He turned to address the crowd, his voice gaining confidence. "I have security clearance for my defense contracts." There was definitely something about a Chen family member being involved in a major operational failure overseas. Sarah felt her blood run cold. She could see other attendees turning to look at each other, confusion and curiosity spreading. through the small crowd like ripples in a pond. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent years avoiding. "Mr. Lawson," Colonel Harrison said firmly, "this is neither the time nor the place for speculation about classified matters." But the damage was already done. Lawson had planted seeds of doubt and curiosity that were beginning to take root. "I'm just saying," he continued, clearly enjoying the attention, "maybe we should be more careful about who we're honoring at these services. Some of these families have complicated histories." Sarah felt every muscle in her body tense. The implication was clear and deeply unfair to Michael's memory. Her brother had died in a routine training exercise, a tragic accident that had nothing to do with combat operations or classified missions. But Lawson's comments were threatening to cast doubt on his service and sacrifice. Margaret Foster, an elderly woman in the third row who had lost her son in Afghanistan, turned to face Lawson with obvious disapproval. "Richard, that's completely inappropriate. These families are here to grieve and remember their loved ones. I'm just looking out for the integrity of this memorial," Lawson replied, his tone becoming defensive. "We owe it to the real heroes to make sure we're not honoring people who might have compromised American interests." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah could feel her carefully constructed anonymity crumbling around her. Other attendees were beginning to whisper among themselves, casting glances in her direction as they tried to figure out if she was connected to the Chen name that had sparked this controversy. Colonel Harrison attempted to regain control of the situation. "I think we should return to the memorial service. These are serious accusations being made without any foundation." "Actually," Lawson said, pulling out his smartphone, "I think I can clear this up pretty quickly." He began typing, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "Let me just check some public records about the Chen family. If there's nothing to hide, then there's no problem with a little transparency." Sarah realized with growing horror that her quiet memorial attendance was about to become a very public investigation into her family's military service. The irony was bitter. She had spent 3 years attending these services without incident. But now her brother's memory was being questioned by a man who had never worn a uniform or faced enemy fire. "Found something," Lawson announced, his voice carrying a note of triumph. There was a Chen involved in Operation Distant Thunder in 2018. A sniper operation that resulted in significant controversy within military intelligence circles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Operation Distant Thunder was classified at the highest levels, and the fact that even partial information had leaked into civilian intelligence briefings meant that someone had been talking. Who shouldn't have been? Colonel Harrison's face had gone pale. "Mr. Lawson, you need to stop this immediately. You're discussing classified information in a public forum. If it's so classified, then why is there a Chen family member sitting right here in our memorial service?" Lawson shot back, his voice rising. "Maybe we deserve some answers about what really happened over there." Sarah could feel the weight of every gaze in the gathering. The elderly veterans, the grieving families, the curious bystanders who had stumbled into what was becoming a very public confrontation about military secrets and family honor. She had 2 choices. She could get up and leave quietly, letting the rumors and speculation follow her, or she could stay and defend her brother's memory against accusations that had no basis in fact. The decision was made easier by what happened next. A teenage girl in the front row, probably the granddaughter of one of the veterans, had taken out her own phone and was recording the confrontation. Sarah realized that within hours, this entire exchange would be posted on social media, complete with speculation about the mysterious Chen family and their alleged connection to classified military operations. "Mr. Lawson," Sarah said quietly, speaking for the first time since the memorial had begun. Her voice was steady, but those who knew what to listen for might have detected something underneath the calm exterior. "You're making accusations about my family without knowing anything about our service or sacrifice." Lawson turned to face her, his expression a mixture of curiosity and smugness. "So you are connected to the Chen mentioned in the intelligence briefings?" Sarah stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. "My brother Michael died serving his country. That's all that matters here. But what about the other Chen?" Lawson pressed. "The one involved in the sniper operation. That caused such controversy. Are you related to that person as well?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the tension building in the small crowd, could sense that this moment was about to determine how her brother's memory would be remembered and how her own carefully constructed civilian life would continue. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military command. "Mr. Lawson, this has gone far enough. You're disrupting a memorial service with unsubstantiated claims about classified operations." "Unsubstantiated?" Lawson's voice rose. "I have security clearance. I know what I've read in the briefings. There was a sniper operation in 2018 that ended badly, and there was a Chen involved. If this woman is related to that person, don't we have a right to know?" Margaret Foster stood up as well, her voice shaking with emotion. "This is disgusting, Richard. We're here to honor the dead, not to satisfy your curiosity about military gossip." But Lawson wasn't backing down. "Military gossip? We're talking about an operation that allegedly ended a major conflict through a single sniper shot, but then resulted in significant controversy within the intelligence community. If there's a cover-up, don't the American people deserve to know?" Sarah felt her world shifting beneath her feet. The careful compartmentalization she had maintained for years was beginning to collapse. Operation Distant Thunder had indeed ended with a single shot, fired from a distance that most military experts considered impossible under the conditions present that day. But the aftermath had been complicated, and the political ramifications had forced everyone involved to maintain absolute secrecy about what had actually happened. "There's no cover-up," Sarah said, her voice still calm but carrying a new edge. That made several people in the crowd look at her more carefully. "Some things are classified for good reasons, and some sacrifices are meant to remain private." Lawson sensed he was onto something significant. "So you do know about the operation? Are you the Chen who was involved?" The direct question cut through all pretense and evasion. Sarah looked around the gathering, seeing curiosity, concern, and growing tension in the faces surrounding her. The teenager was still recording, and Sarah realized that her answer would determine not just how this confrontation ended, but how the rest of her life would unfold. Colonel Harrison moved closer to Sarah, his expression suggesting that he was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. "Ma'am, you don't have to answer any of these questions. This is completely inappropriate." But Sarah could see that remaining silent would only fuel more speculation and controversy. The truth about Operation Distant Thunder had been buried for good reasons, but those reasons were about protecting diplomatic relationships and intelligence sources, not about hiding any wrongdoing or failure. "My brother Michael," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering, "died in a training accident that had nothing to do with combat operations or classified missions. His service was honorable, and his sacrifice was real. That's what we're here to remember." Lawson wasn't satisfied with the deflection. "But what about you? Were you involved in Operation Distant Thunder or not?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then at the faces of the other attendees. Most looked uncomfortable with the confrontation, but she could see that curiosity was winning out over propriety. The teenager was still recording, and Sarah knew that her next words would be broadcast to the world within hours. "Mr. Lawson," she said quietly, "what do you think you know about Operation Distant Thunder?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. I know it involved a sniper shot that ended a major conflict. I know there was controversy afterward within the intelligence community. And I know there was a Chun involved who later disappeared from all public records. Sarah nodded slowly. And what makes you think any of that information is accurate? Because I have security clearance, Lawson replied, his confidence beginning to waver slightly. I've seen the briefing documents, have you? Sarah's voice carried a note of skepticism that made several people lean forward to listen more carefully. Or have you seen carefully edited summaries designed to provide cover for ongoing operations while satisfying bureaucratic requirements for documentation? The distinction was subtle but significant, and Colonel Harrison was beginning to look very uncomfortable. Sarah could see that he was starting to understand that this conversation was venturing into territory that could have serious national security implications. "Ma'am," the colonel said quietly, "perhaps we should continue this discussion in private." But Sarah could see that the damage was already done. The confrontation had drawn attention from other people in the area, and a small crowd was beginning to gather around the memorial service. Someone else had started recording, and Sarah realized that within minutes, multiple versions of this exchange would be circulating online. Margaret Foster spoke up again, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lost a child in military service. "Richard, you should be ashamed of yourself. This woman came here to honor her brother's memory, and you've turned it into a circus." "I'm trying to honor all our service members," Lawson replied defensively, "by making sure we're not celebrating people who might have compromised American interests." The accusation was clear and deeply unfair. Sarah felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. She had spent years building a quiet life where no one knew about her military service or the classified operations she had participated in. But now, because of one man's curiosity and need for attention, all of that was being threatened. "Mr. Lawson," Sarah said, her voice still controlled, but carrying a warning that made several veterans in the crowd look at her with new interest. "You're making accusations about things you don't understand, against people who have made sacrifices. You can't imagine." "Then enlighten us," Lawson shot back. "If there's nothing to hide, then there's no reason to be evasive." Sarah looked around the gathering one more time, seeing the mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and growing tension in the faces surrounding her. The peaceful memorial service had become a confrontation about military secrets and family honor, and she realized that there was no way to diffuse the situation without revealing information that was meant to remain classified forever. But as she looked at the faces of the other veterans and military families, Sarah saw something that made her decision easier. These were people who understood sacrifice and service. They knew the weight of secrets and the cost of protecting those secrets. If she was going to trust anyone with the truth, it would be this group of people who had earned the right to know through their own service and sacrifice. "Colonel Harrison," Sarah said, turning to face the distinguished officer, "you mentioned earlier that some things are classified for good reasons. Do you believe that's still true when civilian contractors are discussing partial intelligence briefings at public memorial services?" The question hit the colonel like a challenge. He looked at Lawson, then back at Sarah, and she could see him weighing the implications of the situation. If classified information was already being discussed publicly by people who didn't understand the full context, then the security justification for maintaining that classification was beginning to break down. "Ma'am," Colonel Harrison said carefully, "I think this situation has become complicated enough that it might require input from people with higher authority than mine." Sarah nodded. "I agree. But in the meantime, we have a memorial service to finish and a crowd of people who deserve to understand why their peaceful gathering has been disrupted by accusations about classified military operations." She turned to face Lawson directly. "You want to know about Operation Distant Thunder?" You want to know about the Chun who was involved in a sniper operation that allegedly ended a major conflict through a single shot fired from an impossible distance? Lawson nodded eagerly, clearly sensing that he was about to get the answers he had been pushing for. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then at the recording devices pointed in her direction, then at the faces of the veterans and military. Families who were waiting to hear what she would say next. Then you should understand, she said quietly, that some shots are fired not for glory or recognition, but because someone has to make the hard choices that allow other people to sleep safely at night. The words carried a weight that made the entire gathering fall silent. Even the traffic noise from the nearby highway seemed to fade away as everyone processed what Sarah had just implied. Colonel Harrison stepped closer to Sarah, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm saying that my brother Michael died, serving his country with honor, and that's what we came here to remember. Everything else is just noise created by people who don't understand the difference between transparency and security." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew that her carefully constructed civilian life was beginning to unravel. The confrontation with Lawson had forced her to reveal more about herself than she had intended, and the recordings being made by multiple bystanders meant that her words would be analyzed and dissected by people far more sophisticated than a small-town defense contractor. Margaret Foster approached Sarah, her voice gentle but concerned. "Dear, are you all right? This must be very difficult for you." Sarah looked at the elderly woman, seeing genuine compassion in her eyes. "I'm fine, Mrs. Foster. Thank you for defending my brother's memory." "He must have been a remarkable young man," Margaret replied. "And I suspect he had a remarkable sister." The comment was casual, but Sarah could see that several people had overheard it and were beginning to connect dots that she would have preferred to remain unconnected. The veteran community was small and tightly connected, and word of this confrontation would spread quickly through informal networks that reached far beyond this local memorial service. Colonel Harrison cleared his throat, addressing the crowd. "I think we should return to the memorial service. We've honored the memory of some remarkable service members today, and that's what's important." But Sarah could see that the damage was already done. The questions raised by Lawson had planted seeds of curiosity that would continue to grow long after this gathering ended. And the recordings being made by multiple bystanders meant that her involvement in this confrontation would be preserved and analyzed by people who had the resources and motivation to dig deeper into classified operations and the people who had participated in them. As the memorial service concluded and people began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by a small group of veterans who seemed reluctant to let her leave without further conversation. They didn't ask direct questions, but their presence communicated clearly that they recognized something in her bearing and responses that suggested military training and experience. "Ma'am," said an elderly Vietnam veteran wearing a purple heart pin, "if you ever need anything, you know how to reach us." The offer was simple but sincere, and Sarah realized that she had just been accepted into a community that she had been observing from the outside for years. But that acceptance came with expectations and responsibilities that she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. As she walked back to her car, Sarah could feel the weight of the morning's events settling over her like a heavy blanket. The quiet life she had built was beginning to crumble, and she had no idea what would take its place. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone with the weight of her secrets and the memories of what she had done in service to her country. The confrontation with Richard Lawson had forced her to defend her brother's memory and acknowledge her own military service, even if she hadn't revealed the full scope of either. But she knew that this was just the beginning. The questions raised today would lead to more questions, and eventually, someone with the right resources and authority would start digging into Operation Distant Thunder and the classified events that had shaped her life. As she drove away from the community center, Sarah caught sight of Lawson in her rearview mirror, standing in the parking lot and talking animatedly on his phone. She had no doubt that he was already reaching out to contacts in the defense community, trying to piece together more information about the Chen family and their connection to classified military operations. The war that had ended with her impossible shot from 3 miles away was about to claim one more casualty: the quiet civilian life that Sarah Chen had spent 3 years building in the aftermath of serving her country in ways that few people could ever imagine. The video appeared on social media platforms within 2 hours of the memorial service ending. By evening, it had been shared across 17 different military forums, 6 defense contractor discussion boards, and numerous veteran Facebook groups. The footage was shaky, captured on a teenager's smartphone, but the audio was clear enough to make out every word of the confrontation between Sarah Chen and Richard Lawson. Sarah discovered the viral spread of her public moment while sitting in her apartment that night, scrolling through her usual evening routine of library science journals and local news websites. A notification from her rarely used Facebook account drew her attention to a message from someone she didn't recognize, containing a link and the words, "Is this you?" The video had already accumulated over 50,000 views and hundreds of comments. Sarah read through them with growing dread, watching as amateur internet investigators began connecting dots and speculating about her identity. Some commenters dismissed the entire exchange as the ramblings of an attention-seeking contractor, but others recognized the careful way Sarah had deflected questions while neither confirming nor denying Lawson's accusations. More concerning were the comments from people who claimed military backgrounds and seemed to recognize something significant in Sarah's responses. A retired Marine gunnery sergeant had written, "That woman moves like she's had advanced training. Watch how she positions herself and controls her breathing even under pressure." A former Army intelligence analyst added, "The way she redirected those questions about classified operations suggests she knows exactly what information is sensitive and what can be discussed publicly." Sarah closed her laptop and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the ordinary suburban street where she had built her anonymous life. 3 years of careful invisibility were unraveling because she had tried to defend her brother's memory at a community memorial service. The irony was bitter, but not entirely unexpected. She had always known that her past would eventually catch up with her. Her phone rang at exactly midnight. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. Northern Virginia, where most defense contractors and government agencies maintained their operations. Sarah Chen? The voice was professional, female, with the kind of authority that came from years of handling sensitive situations. "Who is this?" "My name is Director Amanda Walsh from the Defense Intelligence Agency. I think we need to talk." Sarah's blood went cold. The DIA was responsible for military intelligence operations, including the oversight of classified sniper programs. If they were calling her directly, it meant the video had been flagged at the highest levels of government. About what? About a video that's currently circulating online, and about some questions that need answers before this situation gets any more complicated. Sarah looked around her modest apartment, at the carefully ordinary life she had constructed. Books on library science, a small television, furniture from discount stores, and absolutely nothing that would suggest any connection to military operations or classified activities. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Ms. Chen, we have satellite surveillance footage from the memorial service this morning. We know you were there, we know what was discussed, and we have a pretty good idea of who you are. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with us voluntarily, or whether this conversation needs to become more formal." The threat was politely phrased but unmistakably clear. Sarah could either agree to meet with DIA representatives, or they would use other methods to compel her cooperation. What kind of cooperation? The kind that helps us understand why a woman with your background has been living under a false identity for the past 3 years, and why you chose this particular moment to surface in connection with discussions about Operation Distant Thunder. Sarah felt the walls of her apartment closing in around her. False identity. They knew about the carefully constructed civilian persona she had built, the forged documentation that had allowed her to disappear from military records and build a new life. I haven't been living under a false identity. I've been living as a private citizen. Private citizens don't usually have their entire service records classified at levels that require presidential authorization to access. Director Walsh replied, "Private citizens don't have social security numbers that were issued through defense intelligence channels. And private citizens don't typically possess the kind of training that would allow them to make a shot like the one that ended the Kashmir conflict." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Kashmir. They weren't just talking about Operation Distant Thunder in general terms. They knew about the specific shot, the impossible distance, the political ramifications that had followed. "I think you have me confused with someone else." 3 miles 217 yards, Walsh said quietly. Wind speed varying between 15 and 22 knots from the southwest. Target elevation 400 feet above your position. Atmospheric pressure dropping due to incoming weather. Humidity at 67%. Temperature 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Shall I continue? The environmental conditions from that day were burned into Sarah's memory. Details she would never forget no matter how much time passed. The fact that Director Walsh could recite them with such precision meant that the DIA had access to operational records that were supposed to be buried, so deep that even most intelligence officials would never see them. Those numbers don't mean anything. To me, they should, because they represent the most difficult shot in modern military history. A shot that ended a regional conflict that could have escalated into nuclear warfare. A shot that saved potentially millions of lives. A shot that was fired by someone who then disappeared from all official records as if she had never existed. Sarah walked to her bedroom window, looking out at the parking lot where her ordinary Honda Civic sat among the other unremarkable vehicles owned by her neighbors. Normal people with normal jobs and normal problems, people who had never been asked to make the kind of decisions that kept them awake at night for years afterward. "Director Walsh, I came to a memorial service to honor my brother's memory. Everything else is speculation and rumor." "Your brother Michael was killed in a training accident at Fort Bragg," Walsh replied. "But that's not the only military connection in your family, is it? Because according to our records, Michael Chen had a sister who served with distinction in several classified operations, before requesting discharge and disappearing from all official documentation." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the day. She had walked away from military service. The paperwork she had signed, the agreements she had made, the promises that her service record would be sealed and her civilian transition would be protected. Promises that were apparently being broken because someone had decided her privacy was less important than satisfying bureaucratic curiosity. "Miss Chen, I'm going to ask you one more time to cooperate voluntarily. We can meet tomorrow morning. At a location of your choosing, have a quiet conversation about some questions that need answers, and hopefully resolve this situation before it escalates further. Or we can do this the hard way, which involves federal marshals and a much less comfortable setting for our discussion." Sarah understood the choice she was being given. Cooperate now, or be compelled to cooperate later under circumstances that would be far more public and damaging to the civilian life she was trying to protect. What kind of questions? Questions about why someone with your skills and background has been living in anonymity for 3 years. Questions about whether your disappearance from military records represents a security risk that needs to be addressed. Questions about your current activities and whether they pose any threat to ongoing operations or national security interests. The accusations were carefully phrased, but the implications were clear. The DA suspected that her civilian life was a cover for something more sinister, that her anonymity was part of a larger plan, rather than simply a desire to escape the psychological weight of her military service. "I've been working as a librarian. I live alone. I don't have any contact with foreign governments or intelligence services, and I haven't done anything that could threaten national security." "Then you shouldn't have any problem explaining that to us in person," Walsh replied. "Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., at the Riverside Diner on Highway 47. Come alone, and we'll keep this conversation as quiet as possible." The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, realizing that her careful anonymity had been completely compromised. The DA knew where she lived, what she did for work, and enough details about her military service to make continuing her civilian charade impossible. She spent the rest of the night going through her apartment, looking at the evidence of the ordinary life she had built. Library science textbooks, romance novels, kitchen appliances she had learned to use, photographs of office holiday parties with colleagues who knew her as the quiet woman who processed book returns and helped elderly patrons navigate the computer system. None of them had any idea that she had once been capable of eliminating targets from distances that challenged the laws of physics. The next morning, Sarah drove to the Riverside Diner in her unremarkable Honda, wearing the same kind of casual clothes she wore to work at the library. But she moved differently now, with the heightened awareness that came from knowing she was walking into a situation that could determine the rest of her life. 3 years of carefully suppressed training began reasserting itself as she scanned the parking lot, noted the positions of other vehicles, and identified potential escape routes out of pure habit. Director Walsh was waiting in a corner booth, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of understated professional appearance that suggested government service. She was accompanied by a younger man in a navy suit who introduced himself as Agent David Kim from the Defense Security Service. "Ms. Chen, thank you for coming," Walsh said as Sarah slid into the booth across from them. "I hope we can clear up some questions and resolve this situation quickly." Sarah ordered coffee from the waitress and looked directly at Walsh. "What questions?" Agent Kim opened a tablet and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared list. "Let's start with your current living situation. You've been residing at the Oakwood Apartments for 3 years, working at the Riverside Public Library, and maintaining what appears to be a completely civilian lifestyle. Can you explain how someone with your military background ended up in such an ordinary situation?" The question was phrased neutrally, but Sarah could hear the suspicion underlying it. To intelligence professionals, her transition from classified military operations to civilian library work probably seemed too dramatic to be genuine. "I wanted a normal life after my discharge. Library work is quiet and doesn't require the kind of skills I used in the military." "What kind of skills?" Walsh asked, leaning forward slightly. Sarah met her gaze steadily. "The kind that are classified and not appropriate for discussion in a public restaurant." Kim made notes on his tablet. "Your discharge was processed through unusual channels. Instead of the standard separation procedures, your paperwork was handled by a special oversight committee that typically deals with highly sensitive cases. Can you explain why?" "I was told that my service record needed to be protected for security reasons." "Protected from whom?" Sarah hesitated, remembering the briefing she had received before her discharge. The explanations about foreign intelligence services, the potential for retaliation, the need for complete anonymity to protect both her safety and ongoing operations from people who might want to retaliate against someone who had participated in classified operations. Walsh nodded. "That's consistent with what we were told when your file was sealed. But 3 years have passed, and the security situation has changed. Some of the operations you participated in are no longer considered sensitive, and your continued anonymity may actually be creating more problems than it solves." What kind of problems? Kim looked up from his tablet. The kind that arise when civilians with security clearances start discussing classified operations at public gatherings, and when videos of those discussions go viral on social media platforms. The reference to Richard Lawson's Bevier epic memorial service was clear, but Sarah detected something else in Kim's tone. They weren't just concerned about protecting classified information. They were concerned about controlling the narrative around operations like Distant Thunder. I didn't discuss any classified information yesterday. No, but you didn't deny the implications either, Walsh replied. And your responses were sophisticated enough to suggest that you know exactly what information is sensitive and what can be safely discussed. That kind of knowledge raises questions about your current activities and your ongoing connection to intelligence operations. Sarah felt the trap closing around her. By demonstrating that she still understood operational security protocols, she had inadvertently suggested that her civilian life might be a cover rather than a genuine transition to ordinary living. Director Walsh, I've been working in a public library for 3 years. My colleagues can verify that I spend my days helping people find books and teaching senior citizens how to use computers. If that's a cover for intelligence activities, it's the most boring cover in history. Walsh smiled, but her eyes remained calculating. Maybe it's the perfect cover for someone who needs to maintain a low profile while staying connected to information networks and communication systems. The accusation was subtle but clear. Public libraries provided internet access, research capabilities, and contact with diverse populations. To someone looking for sinister explanations, Sarah's job could be viewed as an ideal position for someone conducting intelligence operations under civilian cover. Kim pulled up something new on his tablet. Let's talk about your finances. You've been living on a library salary for 3 years, but your spending patterns suggest access to additional resources. You pay cash for most purchases you don't. Use credit cards, and you maintain bank accounts that were established through unusual channels. Sarah had hoped they wouldn't dig that deep into her background, but she should have known better. Intelligence agencies had access to financial records that could reveal patterns invisible to ordinary investigation. I live simply and save money. You live like someone who's been trained to avoid creating financial trails that could be tracked, Walsh corrected. Your banking practices are consistent with someone maintaining operational security, not someone who simply wants to save money. The observation was accurate but unfair. Sarah had indeed maintained the financial habits she had learned during her military service, partly out of caution and partly because they had become second nature. But those same habits now made her civilian life appear suspicious to people looking for evidence of ongoing intelligence activities. Maybe I'm just cautious about privacy. Or maybe you're maintaining the kind of financial security that would allow you to disappear quickly if the situation required it, Kim suggested. Sarah looked around the diner, noting the other customers and staff, wondering if any of them were additional DIA personnel positioned to prevent her from leaving if this conversation took an unexpected turn. The paranoid thinking was automatic, a result of training that had never fully faded even after 3 years of civilian life. Walsh seemed to notice her assessment of the restaurant environment. Ms. Chen, you're demonstrating exactly the kind of behavior that concerns us. Most librarians don't automatically scan for potential threats when they enter a room. The comment was both accurate and frustrating. Sarah's military training had become so deeply ingrained that she couldn't turn it off completely, even when she desperately wanted to appear as an ordinary civilian. Maybe I'm just naturally observant. Or maybe you're someone who's been trained to expect trouble and knows how to handle it when it arrives, Walsh replied. Which brings us to the real question we need to discuss. Kim closed his tablet and leaned back in his seat. Miss Chen, we know about the shot that ended the Kashmir conflict. We know about the distance, the conditions, and the political ramifications. What we don't know is why someone capable of that level of performance chose to disappear from military service immediately afterward. The question had been building throughout the entire conversation, and Sarah had been dreading it. The truth about why she had requested discharge was complicated, involving psychological factors and political considerations that she had never discussed with anyone. I was tired of killing people. The simple honesty of the statement seemed to catch both agents off guard. Walsh studied Sarah's expression, looking for signs of deception or evasion. That's it? You walked away from a distinguished career in special operations because you were tired of the work. I walked away because I realized that no matter how good I was at killing people, it never seemed to solve the underlying problems that created the need for killing in the first place. Kim made more notes. That's a rather philosophical perspective for someone in your line of work. Maybe that's why I was good at it, Sarah replied. Because I understood the weight of what I was being asked to do. Walsh leaned forward again. The Kashmir shot saved potentially millions of lives. The target you eliminated was coordinating attacks that could have escalated into nuclear warfare between India and Pakistan. How can you describe that mission as not solving underlying problems? The question touched on something that Sarah had struggled with throughout her civilian transition. The shot that ended her military career had indeed prevented a catastrophic war, but it had also eliminated a human being whose death created its own set of political complications and moral questions. Because 3 months after I made that shot, someone else took that target's place, and the same tensions that created the conflict were still there. I prevented one war, but I didn't address any of the fundamental issues that make wars inevitable. So you decided that the solution was to become a librarian? Sarah heard the skepticism in Walsh's voice, but also something else. A recognition that her explanation was more sophisticated than simple war weariness or psychological trauma. I decided that maybe I could do more good helping people access information and education than I could eliminating targets that would just be replaced. My other targets. Kim looked up from his tablet. That's a noble sentiment, but it doesn't explain why someone with your capabilities chose to completely disappear from military service, rather than transitioning to a training or advisory role. The question revealed the real source of their suspicion. Intelligence agencies could understand someone wanting to leave active operations, but Sarah's complete withdrawal from all military connections suggested something more significant than career burnout. I needed a complete break from that world. I needed to find out who I was when I wasn't being defined by my ability to kill people from impossible distances. Walsh studied Sarah's expression carefully. And what did you find? I found out that I like helping elderly people learn to use computers. I found out that I enjoy recommending books to teenagers who think they hate reading. I found out that there's satisfaction in ordinary human interactions that don't involve life and death decisions. The explanation was entirely true, but Sarah could see that it didn't satisfy the intelligence professionals across from her. To people who had dedicated their careers to national security, her transition to civilian life probably seemed like a waste of valuable skills and training. Ms. Chen, I'm going to be direct with you, Walsh said. The video from yesterday's memorial service has raised questions at the highest levels of government. People are asking whether your civilian life represents a security risk, whether your anonymity has been compromised in ways that could affect ongoing operations, and whether you need to be brought back under official oversight. The threat was politely phrased, but unmistakably clear. Sarah's attempt to live as a private citizen was being viewed as a potential national security problem that might require official intervention. What kind of official oversight? Kim reopened his tablet. The kind that would involve regular contact with intelligence personnel, periodic security reviews, and restrictions on your travel and communications. Essentially, the kind of monitoring that we apply to retired intelligence operatives who possess sensitive information. Sarah felt her carefully constructed civilian life crumbling around her. The freedom and anonymity she had fought so hard to achieve were being threatened because someone had recorded her defending her brother's memory at a public memorial service. And if I refused to accept that kind of oversight? Walsh's expression grew more serious. Then we would have to consider whether someone with your capabilities and knowledge represents a threat that needs to be addressed through other means. The implication was clear and deeply disturbing. Sarah realized that her choice wasn't between cooperation and independence. Her choice was between voluntary cooperation and forced compliance under much less favorable circumstances. Director Walsh, I've been living quietly for 3 years without causing any problems or security concerns. The only reason we're having this conversation is because a defense contractor decided to harass me at my brother's memorial service. That's true, Walsh agreed. But the fact remains that your cover has been compromised, and your continued anonymity may no longer be possible to maintain. Sarah looked out the window at the parking lot, where her ordinary Honda sat among the other vehicles. 3 years of careful invisibility were ending because she had tried to honor her brother's memory and defend his service against unfounded accusations. What do you want from me? Walsh and Kim exchanged glances, and Sarah could see that they had reached the point in the conversation they had been building toward from the beginning. We want you to consider returning to active duty, Walsh said quietly. Not in an operational capacity, but in a training and advisory role. Your skills and experience are too valuable to waste on library work, and your recent public exposure has created an opportunity to bring you back into official channels. The offer was presented as a choice, but Sarah understood the underlying compulsion. Her civilian life was being taken away regardless of her preferences, and the question was whether she would accept a role in the intelligence community voluntarily or be forced into compliance through less pleasant methods. What kind of training? An advisory role? Kim looked down at his tablet. Teaching advanced marksmanship to special operations candidates. Developing new training protocols based on your experience in extreme distance shooting. Consulting on operational planning for missions that require precision elimination of high-value targets. Sarah felt a familiar weight settling over her shoulders. The weight of responsibility for life and death decisions. The weight of secrets that couldn't be shared. The weight of skills that marked her as fundamentally different from ordinary people. And if I prefer to continue working at the library? Walsh's expression grew cold. Then we would have to consider whether someone who refuses to use their abilities in service of national security might be using those abilities for other purposes. The accusation was subtle but unmistakable. If Sarah refused to work for the intelligence community, they would assume she was working for someone else. Sarah looked at the 2 agents across from her, understanding finally that her civilian life had been an illusion from the beginning. She had never really escaped her military service. She had simply been allowed to believe she had escaped as long as her anonymity remained intact. I need time to think about this. You have until tomorrow morning, Walsh replied. After that, this situation becomes much more complicated for everyone involved. As Sarah drove home from the diner, she realized that the war that had ended with her impossible shot from 3 miles away was about to claim another casualty. The ordinary woman she had tried to become was disappearing, replaced by the weapon she had always been, but had hoped to leave behind forever. Sarah Chen sat in her car outside the federal building in downtown Los Angeles, staring at the imposing glass and concrete structure that housed multiple intelligence agencies. 24 hours had passed since her ultimatum at the Riverside diner, and she had spent every minute wrestling with a decision that would determine the trajectory of the rest of her life. Return to the world of classified operations and sanctioned killing, or face the consequences of refusing to cooperate with people who viewed her civilian existence as a potential threat to national security. Her phone had been ringing intermittently. Since dawn, calls from unknown numbers that she hadn't answered. The viral video from the memorial service had now been viewed over 2 million times, spawning dozens of conspiracy theory discussions and amateur investigative threads across social media platforms. Someone with advanced digital forensic skills had enhanced the audio quality, making her carefully measured responses even clearer and more intriguing to internet detectives, convinced they were witnessing the exposure of a government cover-up. The building's security checkpoint required surrendering all personal electronics, a standard procedure that Sarah recognized from her military service. The guards were polite but thorough, and she noticed they spent extra time examining her identification and cross-referencing her information with databases that weren't accessible to ordinary visitors. Director Walsh was waiting in a sterile conference room on the 10th floor, but she wasn't alone. The meeting had expanded to include Deputy Director Marcus Reynolds from the CIA, Colonel Jennifer Hayes from Army Intelligence, and a woman who introduced herself only as Ms. Stevens from an agency she didn't name. The presence of multiple intelligence organizations suggested that Sarah's situation had escalated far beyond a simple security review. "Ms. Chen, thank you for coming," Director Walsh said, gesturing to an empty chair across from the assembled officials. "I hope you've had time to consider our discussion yesterday." Sarah took the offered seat, noting that it was positioned to prevent easy access to the door, and placed her under the direct observation of all four officials. The arrangement was designed to create psychological pressure, a technique she recognized from her own training in interrogation resistance. "I've considered it," Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral. "But I have some questions of my own before I make any commitments." Deputy Director Reynolds leaned forward, his expression suggesting that he wasn't accustomed to having his authority questioned. "Ms. Chen, I don't think you fully understand the gravity of your situation. The video from the memorial service has generated significant attention from foreign intelligence services. We have confirmation that at least 3 hostile nations are actively investigating the identity of the woman who made the Kashmir shot." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained anonymity hadn't just been compromised domestically. Foreign intelligence agencies were now hunting for information about her identity and current location. "Which nations?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Colonel Hayes consulted a tablet before responding. "Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence has assigned a dedicated team to identifying American snipers involved in regional conflicts. Chinese Ministry of State Security has flagged the Kashmir operation as part of their ongoing assessment of U.S. Special Operations capabilities. And Iranian intelligence services have been tracking participants in Middle Eastern operations that affected their strategic interests." Each name on the list represented a potential death sentence. Sarah had eliminated targets whose deaths had disrupted carefully planned operations and cost these nations significant political and military advantages. Her anonymity hadn't just been about privacy, it had been about survival. Ms. Stevens spoke. For the first time, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested very high security clearances and access to information that wasn't shared with ordinary intelligence officers. "The Kashmir shot didn't just end a regional conflict, Ms. Chen. It eliminated General Rashid Hassan, who was coordinating a multinational alliance that could have fundamentally shifted the balance of power in South Asia. His death created a power vacuum that prevented the formation of a nuclear-armed coalition that would have threatened American interests for decades." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. She had been told that her target was a regional warlord whose elimination would prevent immediate military escalation. But the full political implications of the shot had apparently been much more significant than she had been briefed at the time. "I was never told about any multinational alliance," Sarah said carefully. "Because that information was classified above your clearance level," Reynolds replied. But the point is that your actions had consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Consequences that have made you a high-value target for multiple hostile intelligence services. Director Walsh opened a file folder and spread several photographs across the table. These were taken 3 days ago outside your apartment building. The man in the gray jacket has been identified as a Pakistani intelligence operative. The woman near the mailboxes is Chinese MSS. They're not just investigating your identity anymore, Ms. Chen. They found you. Sarah studied the photographs, recognizing the parking lot and building entrance of her apartment complex. The surveillance had been professional but not invisible, which has suggested that the foreign operatives either didn't care about being detected or wanted her to know she was being watched. How long have they been there? Since the video went viral, Colonel Hayes replied. The facial recognition software available to foreign intelligence services is sophisticated enough to identify individuals from low-quality smartphone footage, especially when that footage is enhanced and analyzed by teams of specialists. Sarah realized with growing horror that her attempt to live anonymously had not just failed, it had actively endangered her safety. The 3 years of quiet civilian life had made her complacent about security measures that would have been second nature during her military service. What do you want me to do about it? Miss Stevens leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the kind of calculation that suggested she was evaluating multiple scenarios simultaneously. That depends on what you're willing to do to protect yourself and American interests. The phrase American interests was loaded with implications that Sarah didn't like. Intelligence agencies had a tendency to define national interests in ways that justified almost any action, including compelling retired operatives to return to active service against their will. I'm willing to take reasonable precautions for my own safety, Sarah said carefully. But I'm not willing to return to operational status just because foreign intelligence services are curious about my identity. Reynolds' expression hardened. Ms. Chen, you don't seem to understand that this situation has moved beyond your personal preferences. Your civilian life has been compromised in ways that affect ongoing operations and national security interests. Whether you like it or not, you're back in the intelligence community. The declaration was delivered with the kind of finality that suggested Sarah's cooperation was no longer being requested, it was being demanded. And if I refuse? Walsh exchanged glances with the other officials before responding. Then we would have to consider protective custody while we assess the full scope of the security breach and determine appropriate countermeasures. Protective custody was a euphemism for detention, and Sarah understood that she was being given a choice between voluntary cooperation and involuntary confinement. Her civilian life wasn't just ending, it was being retroactively declared a security risk that required immediate correction. How long would this protective custody last? Until we're satisfied that foreign intelligence services are no longer actively hunting for you, Colonel Hayes replied, which could be months or years, depending on how successfully we can manage the information that's already been compromised. Sarah looked around the conference room, noting the lack of windows and the heavy security measures that isolated this space from the outside world. She was already in a form of custody, surrounded by officials who viewed her as both an asset to be protected and a threat to be controlled. What kind of cooperation are you looking for? Miss Stevens opened her own file folder, revealing documents that Sarah recognized as operational planning materials. We want you to help us identify and neutralize the foreign intelligence operatives who are currently tracking you. Use yourself as bait to draw them into situations where we can capture or eliminate them. The proposal was breathtakingly cynical. They wanted her to risk her life to clean up a security problem that had been created by their failure to maintain her anonymity in the first place. You want me to become a target so you can catch the people who are hunting me? We want you to become an active participant in protecting American interests, Reynolds corrected. Your skills and experience make you uniquely qualified to handle this type of operation." Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the same emotion she had experienced when military commanders had asked her to take increasingly dangerous assignments while minimizing the personal cost and psychological impact of her service. "What makes you think I'm willing to risk my life to fix a problem that you created by failing to protect my identity?" The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Walsh, Reynolds, Hayes, and Stevens all stared at Sarah with expressions that ranged from surprise to barely contained hostility. Intelligence officials weren't accustomed to having their authority questioned so directly. "Miss Chen," Walsh said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge, "I don't think you fully appreciate the seriousness of your situation. This isn't a negotiation. This is us informing you of the reality you now face." Sarah stood up from her chair, a movement that immediately attracted the attention of all four officials. She could see their hands moving toward weapons or communication devices, automatic responses to what they perceived as a potential threat. "Director Walsh, I've spent 3 years trying to build a normal life after serving my country with distinction. I've asked for nothing except to be left alone. And now you're telling me that my privacy and safety are acceptable casualties in whatever political games you're playing with foreign intelligence services." "This isn't a game," Ms. Stevens replied coldly. "This is national security, and your personal preferences are secondary to protecting American interests." The phrase American interests was becoming a catch-all justification for compelling Sarah to sacrifice her civilian life and personal safety. She realized that to these officials, she wasn't a person who had earned the right to privacy and anonymity through her service. She was a weapon that belonged to the government, regardless of her own wishes. "My personal preferences include not being murdered by foreign intelligence operatives who are hunting me because you failed to maintain operational security around my identity." Colonel Hayes stood as well, her military bearing suggesting that she viewed Sarah's resistance as insubordination that needed to be corrected. "Ms. Chun, you took an oath to defend American interests when you accepted classified assignments. That oath doesn't expire just because you've decided you want to work in a library." The accusation was both unfair and revealing. Sarah had indeed taken oaths of service, but those oaths had been fulfilled through years of dangerous assignments and personal sacrifice. The suggestion that her service created a permanent obligation to accept new risks and missions was a betrayal of the agreements she had been given when she requested discharge. "Colonel, I fulfilled my oath through multiple deployments and operations that asked me to make decisions and take actions that most people couldn't handle. I was promised that my civilian transition would be protected and respected." "Promises change when circumstances change," Reynolds interjected. "The security environment is different now, and your continued anonymity is no longer possible to maintain." Sarah realized that she was witnessing something that shouldn't have surprised her but did. The intelligence community's casual willingness to break commitments when it became convenient to do so. The same agencies that had promised to protect her civilian life were now declaring that those promises were void because honoring them had become inconvenient. "So what you're telling me is that the government's word is worthless when it conflicts with bureaucratic convenience?" Walsh's expression grew dangerous. "What we're telling you is that reality has changed, and you need to adapt to new circumstances whether you like it or not." Sarah looked around the room one more time, understanding finally that she was facing people who viewed her as property rather than a person. Her skills, experience, and willingness to take on dangerous assignments had made her valuable to them, but that value came with strings that they were now pulling tight around her freedom. "I want to speak with General Patricia Hayes." The request seemed to catch all four officials off guard. Miss Stevens was the first to respond, her voice carrying a note of surprise mixed with concern. "General Hayes is not involved in this operation. General Hayes was the commanding officer who authorized my discharge and guaranteed my civilian transition. Sarah replied. If you're going to override those agreements, she has a right to know about it. Reynolds shook his head. This situation has moved beyond General Hayes' jurisdiction. She's no longer in a position to influence these decisions. The phrasing was careful, but Sarah detected something ominous in the way Reynolds avoided specifying exactly what had changed about General Hayes' authority or involvement. What happened to General Hayes? Walsh and Reynolds exchanged glances that confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that something significant had occurred that she wasn't being told about. General Hayes is currently under investigation for irregularities in the handling of classified personnel transitions, Walsh said finally, including questions about the procedures used to process your discharge. Sarah felt the floor falling away beneath her feet. General Hayes had been the one person in the military hierarchy who had understood the psychological cost of her service and had fought to protect her right to civilian anonymity. If Hayes was under investigation, it meant that the political protection Sarah had relied on for 3 years was gone. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggests some personnel transitions were handled outside normal channels for reasons that may not have been consistent with national security interests, Miss Stevens replied. The accusation was vague but clearly implied that General Hayes had acted improperly in approving Sarah's discharge and civilian transition. The timing of the investigation, coming immediately after Sarah's public exposure, suggested that it might be politically motivated rather than based on genuine security concerns. You're destroying General Hayes' career to justify breaking the commitments she made to protect veterans who had served in classified operations. We're investigating potential security breaches that may have compromised ongoing operations. Colonel Hayes corrected. General Hayes' career is a casualty of decisions she made that prioritized individual preferences over national security requirements. Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that she was witnessing a deliberate, political operation designed to eliminate the obstacles to compelling her return to active service. General Hayes was being sacrificed to remove the one person who had the authority and motivation to protect Sarah's right to civilian life. This is unconscionable, Sarah said, her voice carrying a cold anger that made all 4 officials shift uncomfortably in their seats. This is necessary, Walsh replied. Your skills are too valuable to waste on library work, and your continued civilian status represents a security risk that we can no longer accept. Sarah walked to the window, looking down at the city street where ordinary people were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that floors above them, intelligence officials, were casually destroying the careers and lives of people who had served their country with distinction. What you're doing to General Hayes is going to send a message to every service member that their government's commitments are worthless, she said, without turning around. What we're doing is protecting American interests, Reynolds replied. General Hayes made decisions that compromise security for personal reasons. The investigation will determine whether those decisions require correction. Sarah turned back to face the assembled officials, understanding finally that she was dealing with people who would sacrifice anyone and anything to maintain their perception of institutional control. And what happens to me if I continue to refuse your generous offer to return to operational status? The question was delivered with enough sarcasm to make clear that Sarah understood exactly what kind of choice she was being given. Miss Stevens smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Then you'll discover that protective custody can be a very long-term arrangement, especially when the threats against you come from multiple hostile nations with sophisticated intelligence capabilities. The threat was politely phrased but unmistakably clear. Sarah could cooperate voluntarily, or she would be detained indefinitely under the guise of protecting her from foreign intelligence services that were hunting her because of the government's failure to maintain her anonymity. Sarah looked at each of the 4 officials, seeing in their faces the kind of bureaucratic ruthlessness that had made her want to leave military service in the first place. They viewed her as a resource to be deployed rather than a person with rights and preferences that deserved respect. "I need time to consider this," she said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning," Walsh replied. "After that, the decision will be made for you." As Sarah was escorted from the building, she realized that the war that had ended with her impossible shot from 3 miles away was about to claim its most bitter casualty yet. Not just her civilian life, but her faith in the institution she had served and the people who had promised to protect her in return for that service. Sarah Chen stood on the rooftop of her apartment building at dawn, watching the sun rise over the city that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. The decision she had wrestled with through a sleepless night was finally clear, carved from the bitter realization that the people she had served viewed her as property rather than a person who had earned the right to choose her own future. Morning air carried the sounds of a world awakening, traffic beginning to build on the highways, the distant hum of aircraft overhead, and the ordinary rhythms of civilian life that she had fought so hard to be part of. Her phone buzzed with another call from an unknown number, the 15th attempt since midnight to reach her from various intelligence agencies. She let it ring unanswered, just as she had ignored all the others. The time for negotiation and compromise had ended in that sterile conference room when Director Walsh and her colleagues had made clear their intention to treat Sarah's service and sacrifice as a permanent mortgage on her freedom. The plan that had crystallized during her long night of reflection was dangerous, potentially suicidal, but it was hers. For the first time in months, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came with tactical clarity and operational focus. She was no longer reacting to other people's manipulations and ultimatums. She was taking control of the situation in the only way that offered any hope of reclaiming her life. Sarah descended to her apartment and began the methodical process of transformation that she had hoped never to undertake again. The quiet librarian who had built a careful civilian existence was disappearing, replaced by someone who possessed skills that most people couldn't imagine and fewer still could survive encountering. She changed into dark clothing suitable for movement and concealment, checked equipment that she had kept stored despite 3 years of hoping she would never need it again, and began mental preparation for actions that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of her future. The first phase of her plan required confirming the extent of the surveillance that Director Walsh had described. Sarah left her apartment through the rear exit, moving with the kind of awareness and tactical precision that had been dormant for years but never truly forgotten. She identified the Pakistani operative within minutes, a professional watcher positioned with clear sight lines to her building's main entrance, but vulnerable to approach from multiple directions that he hadn't adequately secured. The Chinese agent was more sophisticated, positioned in a vehicle that offered mobility and communication while maintaining visual contact with the target area. But her training had anticipated such arrangements, and she moved through the urban environment with techniques that had been developed specifically to defeat surveillance by hostile intelligence services. Sarah spent 2 hours confirming the full scope of the foreign surveillance, identifying a total of 5 operatives from 3 different nations who were maintaining overlapping coverage of her apartment and daily routines. Their presence validated Director Walsh's claims about the international interest in her identity, but it also confirmed that the intelligence agencies who claimed to be protecting her had allowed the situation to deteriorate to the point where her safety was genuinely at risk. More importantly, the surveillance revealed something that the American intelligence officials hadn't mentioned in their briefings. The foreign operatives weren't just observing Sarah's activities. They were preparing for direct action, positioning equipment and personnel that suggested an imminent attempt at capture or elimination. The timeline for her decision had been compressed not just by bureaucratic pressure, but by the reality that hostile forces were planning to move against her within days or hours. Sarah returned to her apartment and placed a single phone call to a number she had memorized years ago but never used. The conversation was brief and conducted in a code that referenced shared experiences from military service that couldn't be fabricated or intercepted meaningfully by hostile listeners. This is Echo 29 requesting immediate extraction and support for a high-priority situation involving multiple hostile intelligence assets. The voice that answered was one she hadn't heard in over 3 years, but it responded with the kind of instant recognition and commitment that she had hoped for, but couldn't be certain still existed. Echo 29, this is Control. Authentication. Confirmed. What kind of support do you need? I need a clean extraction from a compromised position and transport to a secure location where I can brief friendly assets on a developing situation that affects ongoing operations and national security interests. The phrasing was deliberately chosen to invoke emergency protocols that bypassed normal bureaucratic channels. Sarah was gambling that her contact still had access to resources that operated outside the influence of the intelligence officials who were trying to compel her cooperation. Understood. Extraction team will be in position in 90 minutes. Monitor Channel 7 for pickup coordination. The line went dead, but Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For the first time since the memorial service confrontation, she was dealing with people who remembered their obligations to protect assets who had served with distinction rather than treating her as a problem to be managed or a resource to be exploited. Sarah spent the next hour preparing for departure, but not in the way that Director Walsh and her colleagues would have expected. Instead of packing personal belongings or attempting to preserve any elements of her civilian life, she focused on documenting evidence of the foreign surveillance and the threats she faced. High-resolution photographs of the hostile operatives, recordings of their communication intercepts, and detailed intelligence assessments that would be valuable to American counterintelligence efforts. The extraction itself was executed with the kind of precision that reminded Sarah why she had trusted these people with her life during her active service. The team appeared exactly on schedule, positioned to provide overwatch and security while moving her to a location that had been selected for maximum defensive advantage and minimal exposure to surveillance or interdiction. Sarah found herself in a safe house that she recognized from previous operations, a facility that had been established to support classified activities and provide secure accommodation for personnel who required protection from hostile intelligence services. But more importantly, she found herself facing people who treated her with the respect and consideration that she had been denied by the officials who claimed to represent American interests. Commander Rebecca Torres was the senior officer coordinating Sarah's extraction, a woman in her 40s whose service record included multiple classified operations and a reputation for protecting personnel under her command. Her first question wasn't about Sarah's willingness to return to operational status or her cooperation with intelligence investigations. Echo 29, what kind of medical attention do you need, and what's your assessment of the immediate threats you're facing? The concern for Sarah's well-being was genuine, and it highlighted the contrast between people who viewed her as a person deserving protection and officials who saw her as a resource to be exploited. I'm physically unharmed, but I've been under surveillance by hostile intelligence operatives for several days, and I have reason to believe they're preparing for direct action against me. Commander Torres made notes on a tablet while maintaining eye contact that communicated both professional competence and personal concern. What kind of direct action? Capture for interrogation or elimination to prevent me from providing information to American intelligence services. The surveillance patterns suggest they're coordinating a multi-pronged approach that would be difficult to detect or prevent using normal security measures. The assessment was delivered with the kind of tactical precision that Commander Torres clearly recognized and appreciated. Sarah wasn't just reporting threats, She was providing actionable intelligence based on professional analysis of hostile activities. What kind of support do you need to address these threats? The question was phrased as an offer of assistance rather than a demand for cooperation. And Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in days, the sense that she was dealing with people who remembered that she had earned the right to be treated as an ally rather than a suspect. I need secure communication with General Patricia Hayes, and I need protection from American intelligence officials who are trying to compel my cooperation through coercion and intimidation. Commander Torres looked up from her tablet with an expression of surprise and concern. General Hayes is currently under investigation by the Inspector General's office. Her communication privileges have been restricted pending resolution of questions about her handling of classified personnel transitions. The confirmation of General Hayes' situation was disappointing, but not unexpected. Sarah had suspected that the timing of the investigation was politically motivated, designed to eliminate the one person with sufficient authority and motivation to protect her right to civilian life. Then I need to speak with someone who has the authority to overrule the decisions being made by Director Walsh and the other officials who are trying to force me back into operational status. Commander Torres set down her tablet and leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the kind of assessment that suggested she was evaluating multiple factors simultaneously. Echo 29, I need to ask you something directly. Are you requesting protection from American intelligence services, or are you requesting support for actions against American intelligence services? The distinction was crucial, and Sarah understood that her answer would determine whether Commander Torres and her team would continue to provide assistance or would be obligated to turn her over to the same officials she was trying to avoid. I'm requesting protection from officials who are violating the agreements that were made when I transitioned to civilian status. I'm not planning any actions against legitimate American interests, but I'm not going to allow myself to be coerced into operational service by people who view my past commitments as meaningless. Commander Torres nodded slowly, and Sarah could see that her response had been evaluated and found acceptable. What do you want to do about the hostile surveillance you've identified? The question revealed that Commander Torres was willing to support more than just passive protection. She was offering assistance with active measures against the foreign intelligence operatives who were threatening Sarah's safety. I want to eliminate them as a threat while gathering intelligence about their activities and objectives that could be useful to American counterintelligence efforts. Sarah paused, then added, but I want to do it in a way that demonstrates my continued loyalty to American interests without accepting coercion from officials who have betrayed the commitments they made to protect veterans who served in classified operations. The proposal was elegant in its complexity. Sarah was offering to neutralize genuine threats to American security, while simultaneously asserting her right to choose the terms of her service, rather than accepting compulsion from people who viewed her as property. Commander Torres spent several minutes reviewing information on her tablet before responding. Echo 29. I'm authorized to provide support for a limited operation designed to neutralize hostile surveillance and gather intelligence about foreign activities targeting American assets. But I need your commitment that this operation will be conducted within legal and ethical parameters. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude mixed with renewed purpose. For the first time in days, she was dealing with people who remembered that her service had earned her the right to be treated as a professional ally rather than a reluctant asset. You have my commitment. This operation will be designed to protect American interests and gather valuable intelligence while demonstrating that veterans who have served with distinction deserve better treatment than they're receiving from some elements of the intelligence community. The next 18 hours unfolded with the kind of precision and coordination that Sarah had missed during her civilian years. Working with a team of professionals who understood both her capabilities and her motivations, she planned and executed an operation that systematically eliminated the foreign surveillance while gathering comprehensive intelligence about the scope and objectives of hostile activities targeting her and potentially other American assets. The Pakistani operative was neutralized through a carefully orchestrated encounter that appeared to be a random street crime but resulted in his capture and interrogation by American counterintelligence personnel. The Chinese surveillance team found themselves dealing with communication failures and equipment malfunctions that forced them to withdraw while leaving behind electronic devices that provided valuable intelligence about their operational methods and objectives. Most importantly, the operation was conducted in a way that demonstrated Sarah's continued effectiveness and loyalty while making clear that her cooperation was being provided voluntarily rather than under coercion. She was reclaiming her agency while serving American interests, proving that the intelligence officials who viewed her as a reluctant asset had fundamentally misunderstood both her character and her motivations. The success of the operation had immediate political ramifications. Within hours of its completion, Sarah received a secure communication from Deputy Director Reynolds, requesting a meeting to discuss new arrangements for her civilian status and ongoing relationship with the intelligence community. The tone of the communication was markedly different from the ultimatums and threats that had characterized her previous interactions with intelligence officials. Reynolds was now requesting rather than demanding, acknowledging that Sarah's demonstration of capability and loyalty had changed the dynamic of their relationship. Sarah agreed to the meeting, but on her own terms and in a location of her choosing, with Commander Torres and her team providing security and support. For the first time since the memorial service confrontation, Sarah was negotiating from a position of strength rather than responding to other people's manipulations. The meeting took place in a neutral location, with Reynolds accompanied by Director Walsh, but without the additional officials who had participated in the previous interrogation. Their body language and tone suggested that they understood the balance of power had shifted in ways that required a fundamentally different approach to securing Sarah's cooperation. "Ms. Chen," Reynolds began, "we owe you an apology. The operation you conducted has provided valuable intelligence and demonstrated your continued commitment to American interests. We may have been overzealous in our assessment of the security risks associated with your civilian status." The admission was carefully phrased, but it represented a significant retreat from the position they had taken during the federal building confrontation. Sarah recognized it as the kind of bureaucratic face-saving that allowed officials to change their positions without acknowledging that their original approach had been wrong. "What kind of new arrangements are you proposing?" Director Walsh leaned forward, her expression suggesting that she had learned to respect Sarah's capabilities and determination. "We're prepared to offer you a consulting arrangement that allows you to maintain your civilian life while providing occasional support for operations that require your specific skills and experience." The proposal was closer to what Sarah had wanted from the beginning, but she wasn't ready to accept it without careful consideration of the terms and conditions. "What kind of consulting arrangement?" Reynolds opened a file folder and extracted documents that appeared to be formal agreements rather than the verbal ultimatums that had characterized their previous interactions. Contract work on a case-by-case basis, with full autonomy to accept or decline specific assignments based on your personal and professional judgment. Sarah reviewed the documents carefully, noting provisions that protected her right to maintain civilian employment and residence while providing compensation and support for any intelligence activities she agreed to undertake. The agreement was structured as a genuine partnership rather than a disguised form of compulsory service. More importantly, the documents included guarantees about the protection of her civilian identity and explicit commitments to avoid the kind of public exposure that had created the current crisis. The intelligence community was offering to help her rebuild the anonymity that their failures had compromised. "What about General Hayes?" Director Walsh's expression grew uncomfortable. But she met Sarah's gaze directly. The investigation into General Hayes' activities has been concluded. No evidence of wrongdoing was found, and she has been cleared to resume her normal duties. The reversal was too convenient to be coincidental, and Sarah understood that General Hayes' vindication was part of the price for securing her cooperation. The intelligence officials had discovered that destroying the careers of people who protected veterans was politically costly and operationally counterproductive. Sarah spent several hours reviewing the proposed agreements and discussing them with Commander Torres, who had experience with similar arrangements and could identify potential problems or ambiguities that might create future conflicts. The final version of the documents included protections and guarantees that exceeded what Sarah had initially hoped for, representing a genuine commitment to treating her as a valued partner rather than a reluctant asset. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood in a different place, both literally and figuratively, from where her story had begun. She had returned to her work at the Riverside Public Library, helping elderly patrons navigate computer systems and recommending books to teenagers who thought they hated reading. But she had also accepted 3 consulting assignments that utilized her unique skills in service of American interests, operations conducted with full autonomy and appropriate compensation. The viral video from the memorial service had been forgotten by most internet users, replaced by newer controversies and sensations. The foreign intelligence operatives who had hunted her were either in American custody or had withdrawn from their surveillance activities after discovering that their target was under the active protection of people who possessed superior capabilities and resources. Most importantly, Sarah had reclaimed her sense of agency and purpose. She was no longer hiding from her past or being compelled to serve against her will. She had found a way to honor her skills and experience while maintaining the civilian life that she valued, proving that the choice between service and personal autonomy had been a false dilemma created by people who didn't understand either her capabilities or her character. The war that had ended with her impossible shot from 3 miles away had finally concluded its claim on her life, not through surrender or defeat, but through her successful assertion of the right to choose her own terms of engagement with the world that had shaped her. Sarah Chen had found her way home, not to the place she had been, but to the person she had chosen to become. 5 years had passed since the memorial service that changed everything. Sarah Chen walked through the corridors of the National Defense University, her footsteps echoing in halls lined with portraits of military heroes whose stories had become legend. Today was different from her usual consulting work. Today, she was here to address the graduating class of the Advanced Sniper Training Program, young men and women who represented the next generation of precision marksmen. The auditorium fell silent as she approached the podium. 300 faces looked up at her, each one representing someone who had chosen to master the deadly art of long-range precision shooting. They knew who she was now. The Kashmir shot was no longer classified, declassified 2 years earlier as part of a broader transparency initiative. The story had become required reading in military academies worldwide. "You've all read the files," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "You know about the distance, the conditions, the political implications. But what you might not understand is what happens after you take a shot that changes history." She paused, looking out at the young faces. Some eager, some nervous, all convinced they understood what they were signing up for. The bullet that ended the Kashmir conflict weighed less than 2 ounces. It traveled for 12 seconds before reaching its target. But the consequences of that shot have been traveling for 8 years and will continue long after all of us are gone. A cadet in the front row raised her hand. Sarah nodded. "Ma'am, do you ever regret taking that shot?" It was the question Sarah had been asked 1,000 times in interviews, briefings, and late-night conversations with fellow veterans. The answer had evolved over the years. becoming more nuanced as she understood the full scope of what that single bullet had accomplished. "I regret that it was necessary," Sarah replied. "I regret that diplomatic solutions had failed so completely that the only way to prevent nuclear war was to eliminate one man from an impossible distance. But I don't regret pulling the trigger when it became clear that millions of lives depended." On that decision, another hand went up. "Ma'am, what advice do you have for someone preparing for that level of responsibility?" Sarah smiled, remembering her own eagerness as a young soldier, her certainty that technical skill and tactical training would be enough to handle whatever missions came her way. "Remember that every shot you take has a name attached to it. Not just the target's name, but the names of everyone whose life is affected by that decision. The families who will grieve, the soldiers who will come home safe, the children who will grow up in a more stable world. Never let yourself forget that you're making decisions about human lives, not just solving mathematical problems." The questions continued for another hour, each one revealing how much these young warriors had to learn about the weight of the profession they had chosen. When the session ended, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of pride and melancholy that came with passing hard-won knowledge to the next generation. As she walked back to her car, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The quiet librarian who had tried to fade into anonymity was gone, replaced by someone who had found a way to honor both her extraordinary past and her desire for meaningful purpose. Her phone buzzed with a text from Commander Torres. "New assignment. If you're interested. Situation developing in Southeast Asia that requires someone with your unique perspective." Sarah smiled, appreciating that even after all these years, her colleague still asked rather than demanded. She typed back a simple response: "Send me the briefings. I'll review them tonight." The war that had ended with her shot from 3 miles away had taught her that some conflicts never truly end. They just transform into new challenges that require the same courage, precision, and moral clarity that had always defined her service. Sarah Chen had found her place in a world that would always need people willing to make the hardest decisions when others could not. She was no longer running from that responsibility or being compelled to accept it against her will. She had chosen it on her own terms, with full understanding of both its costs and its necessity. The impossible shot that ended one war had become the foundation for a different kind of service, one that honored both the woman she had been and the person she had chosen to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.